All right, thank you. Thanks for making the mic work. A well-known and recurring vice of conservatism is a bias toward pessimism tinged with nostalgia. Think of Whittaker Chambers' remark about leaving the winning side when he turned against communism, or about the most common understanding of National Review's opening statement that it meant to stand athwart history yelling "Stop." Think, for that matter, of Burke's lament that the age of chivalry is gone and the glory of Europe is extinguished forever. And while Americans have a self-understanding as an optimistic people, we also have a tradition of deep worry about the Republic's future. Lincoln, in 1837, spoke of the increasing disregard for law which pervades the country. The salutary civic memory of the Revolution, he said, was inevitably fading. That was James Madison's concern as well, as early as 1788, when he wrote that it was too early for politicians to presume on our forgetting the fundamental principles of the Revolution, a remark that presupposes that with time we would forget. And a little earlier still came Franklin's famous remark that we had a republic if you can keep it. In recent years, conservatives who believe in limited constitutional government and the free markets it makes possible have had our own reasons to bemoan the passing of a better era. Some of us were surprised to learn, for one thing, that we're not the only kind of conservatives in the wild. In both parties, we have seen an increasing, if baffling, confidence in the ability of central governments to bring about desired economic outcomes via targeted tax increases, subsidies, and government stakes in formerly private enterprises. A debate over controlling the growth of entitlement programs has been replaced by one over expanding them yet more recklessly. And those of us who retain the skepticism about ambitious government that once seemed to define the right are ceaselessly told that we are obsolete. We do not, the cliche has it, know what time it is. To judge from various articles and social media posts, it's a time for strongman rule. It's a time to let go of a constitution that has served our country reasonably well, exceptionally well when we've actually adhered to it. It's a time to forget everything we know, everything we've ever learned about how government plans can go awry. Let's reset the clock. It's a time of tax cuts. State after state, governed by Republicans, has cut its top tax rate and flattened its tax structure. It's a time of constitutional reclamation. The Supreme Court is as attuned to the original understanding of constitutional provisions as it has been in 100 years. Even as some of the justices in the majority face criticism from the right for their alleged uselessness, their commitment to undoing the left's rewriting of the law from the bench has delivered one practical victory after another on racial preferences, on religious freedom, on the right to life, on the power of bureaucrats, and more. It's also a time when school choice, including private and parochial school options, has expanded much faster and further than in the many previous decades that conservatives and libertarians have been advocating it. This victory is worth dwelling on a little. School choice is a classic fusionist policy, one that unites most supporters of markets with most religious traditionalists. And it runs directly counter to a set of arguments that's been raised against freedom conservatives. According to these arguments, it's naive, hopeless, or even wrong to seek any governmental retreat from morally freighted social domains in the name of pluralism and the autonomy of civil society. The thing to do instead is to capture the state and use it to impose sound values. Now, in truth, both courses of action can be pursued simultaneously. We can, for example, both allow people to contribute more to educational savings accounts and to mandate reasonable disciplinary policies in public schools. The defect of the anti-libertarian argument is its absolutism and practical misjudgment, because it turns out that in some important cases, it is possible for government to step back in a way that creates more space for traditionalists than others. And this can be easier to accomplish and have more benefits in general than maintaining the same degree of government control while changing its ends. What time is it? Well, we freedom conservatives know it's not 1981. We face different problems than Ronald Reagan did, and the solutions have to be different too. Some of us had been saying so for years before our self-appointed timekeepers came along. The left is different too, and thus also the character of our battles. But we also know that the changes in our circumstances have made some free market, limited government reforms more urgent rather than less. In Reagan's time, young people didn't face a housing shortage that destroyed opportunity and impeded the formation of families. That shortage has to be answered in the main by rolling back limits, government-imposed limits, on the supply of housing. Reforming Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security should be higher priorities now than they were in Reagan's day, when they accounted for much less in the federal budget and the national economy, and the federal debt itself was much lower. An economic strategy of using federal money to funnel more people and resources into higher education without giving much thought to reforming higher education made much more sense decades ago than it does today. None of this is to deny that governments play a legitimate and even indispensable role in securing, structuring, and sometimes restraining markets. Conservatives should, as we've usually done, balance competing goods. I think, personally, that we ought to give serious consideration to limiting companies' use of just-in-time scheduling, for instance, in the interest of family life, although we shouldn't pretend that any such policy would be cost-free. Nor do I mean that conservatives whose priority is free markets should oppose, disdain, or refuse to cooperate politically with conservatives whose priorities lie elsewhere, whether it be in strengthening national defense, guarding public safety, maintaining U.S. sovereignty, promoting social cohesion, or creating suitable conditions for raising children. What I deny is that an excess of market freedom is a major problem in American life. That diagnosis is in many areas the direct opposite of the truth. And that means that freedom conservatives continue to have a lot of work to do. As I hope my remarks thus far have suggested, that work will involve a discriminating approach to those on the right who are described or describe themselves as post-liberals, integralists, national conservatives, or national populists, or most tediously of all, the new right, which is a recycling of an old label. The variety of these terms, vagueness with which they are defined, both counsel caution in generalizing about these groups. So do the occasionally bitter arguments among the people these terms aim to cover. Sometimes it seems that the organizing principle for this political tendency should be called fissionism. From here on, I'll use the term national conservatives, not least because it lends itself to the handy abbreviation of NatCon. I should note that I speak as someone who enthusiastically signed the Freedom Conservative Statement of Principles when it was released in 2023, but also endorses nearly the entirety of the National Conservative Statement of Principles that came out a year earlier. My main reservations about the NatCon document mostly concern empirical matters rather than questions of principle. Thus, I share the statement's concern about the prevalence of pornography in our society, but I don't attribute that prevalence to the reach of transnational corporations. Nor do I agree with the statement's analysis of trends in American manufacturing. What I would say to free cons when we encounter NatCon arguments, proposals, and personalities is that we need to sift, both finding common ground where possible and identifying real points of disagreement and arguing them out. So when people say they oppose the separation of church and state, we should ask what they mean. If they support keeping the Bladensburg cross on public property, the use of prayers to open official meetings, the option to use scholarship credits at religious schools, the eligibility of religious institutions to participate in government programs that are also open to secular institutions, all of that's reasonable, and on the best reading of the Constitution, legitimate in our system of government. If, on the other hand, they mean that governments may use coercive methods to spread particular religious beliefs, then neither of those judgments apply. And if they say what they're really after is a monarchy or a confessional state in the United States, well then, I would recommend politely moving along. They may say they want a foreign policy for Americans. If they mean by that existing and future commitments and policies should be evaluated based on hard-headed judgments of how well they serve our needs for security and prosperity. That we should pursue the desires of other countries only insofar as they coincide with our own. That we should oppose letting supranational organizations limit our freedom of action to pursue the policies we think best, then they're right. If they mean that we can retreat behind our borders while the rest of the world sinks into nuclear proliferation and state-sponsored terrorism, then we should tell them firmly that their view of U.S. interests is dangerously narrow and naive. When they extol nationalism, we should remember that as estimable and historically grounded and neoconservative intellectual as Irving Kristol did as well, and then ask, does that mean that our politics should emphasize the national interest, national sovereignty, and national cohesion? And what should that mean in practice? Does it mean, as I hope, that U.S. policy, including immigration policy, should place the interests of American citizens, including naturalized immigrants, ahead of those of foreigners? Or does it mean, as too often seems to be the case, that a subset of Americans is being implicitly or explicitly placed ahead of the rest of our countrymen? If they say they want a trade policy that helps American workers, we should hear them out, but also insist that American workers include the ones who work in export industries and the ones who work in fields that use imported supplies. We can affirm in principle that there may be solid reasons of national security to limit certain exports to hostile countries or encourage production of certain goods at home or in allied nations, without accepting these as reasons to raise the price of sugar for American consumers. The advocates of activist central government are quick to affirm that its role must be determined by prudence rather than axiom, but they're all too slow to use that prudence to announce any limits on that activism. As we engage in these debates, though, freedom conservatives shouldn't overlook the beams in our own eyes. One is complacency, another vice to which conservatism is naturally prone as a disposition rooted in gratitude for the blessings that we enjoy. When the policies proposed to address a particular problem are ones we oppose, too often we assume that the problem doesn't exist. We oppose most climate regulations and climate alarmism, correctly, I think, and therefore some of us conclude that human activity doesn't create any climate-related risks. Well, that example illustrates that the problems are indeed often exaggerated, as even the United Nations has very recently admitted. But in other cases, we can act as Pollyannas. We, or at least some of us sometimes, tell young people that our country has never been richer, which is correct, and that they should buckle down and get on with their lives rather than complain about the economic system, which is only half true. It's fine, it's important even, to tell people that their difficulties are not the result of a conspiracy of billionaires and that they have a lot of control over their own destinies. But it's also important to tell them that some of their frustrations are justifiable responses to the ways that government policies have made housing, healthcare, and higher education too expensive. A second mistake freedom conservatives should take care to avoid is to accept an oversimplified view of our own history. What I have in mind here is the caricature that conservatives spent decades dogmatically fixated on free markets and only on that, to the exclusion of political realism or any concern for the cultural preconditions of a free society. NatCons sometimes promote this caricature, even though it scants their own roots in the post-World War II conservative tradition. Freedom conservatives sometimes embrace the same caricature to exaggerate the NatCons' apostasy, but they do so at the price of narrowing our own appeal. The historical Reaganite alternative to today's policy of blanket protectionism, modified by spastic protectionism and lobbyist-driven exemptions, was not pure free trade. Conservatives supported controls on exports to the Soviet Union. They were willing to tolerate tariffs in selected cases to give particular industries breathing room or as a means of furthering a broader free trade agenda. Nor is the fear shown by Republican politicians about controlling entitlements a peculiar phenomenon explicable by the rise of populism. It's the brief Paul Ryan era in conservatism that was the exception. Leaving entitlements alone to grow is the historical norm for conservative politicians, albeit an increasingly deplorable one, and can be explained by public opinion being what it is and politicians being what they are. The thing about human nature, as I believe George Will once put it, is that there's always a lot of it around. Strangest of all is the claim, sometimes advanced by supposedly reputable scholars, that conservatives in the tradition of Buckley and Reagan are rights liberals, committed to strict neutrality about different ways of life and different conceptions of the good. Now, if you were capable of convincing yourself that Ed Meese was part of a political movement that was enthralled to the theories of John Rawls, it may be you who has decided to remain behind a veil of ignorance. I would commend to all sides of intra-conservative debates a fuller appreciation of the actual history of conservatism. But there's also the here and now, and there's a final set of mistakes that I'd like to caution freedom conservatives against, and these concern immigration policy. The freedom conservative statement makes a very nice start in setting a policy that avoids the extreme of open borders. It says that the United States, as a sovereign nation, has the right to secure its borders and design a rational immigration policy built on the rule of law that advances the interests and values of American citizens. That sentence is compatible with a wide range of immigration policies, and there is wisdom in casting a wide net. Judgments about the right level and type of immigration can reasonably vary, and the right policy in one time and place may not be the right one in other circumstances. My purpose here is to caution against the assumption that our advocacy for a free society necessarily entails support for high levels of immigration in all circumstances. I should confess that I occupy an unusual position in these debates, in that I'm not persuaded by the economic cases for or against immigration. Supporters of low immigration say that immigration has kept wages flat over the last generation. I think the best evidence indicates both that wages have grown and that immigration, at worst, has reduced the wages of the small and shrinking population of native-born Americans without high school diplomas, and importantly, of immigrants themselves who work in low-wage jobs. The case that immigration strengthens the U.S. economy, meanwhile, generally overlooks the fact that most of the gains, reasonably enough, flow to the immigrants themselves. When the benefits of additional immigration to people already here have been calculated, they've typically involved several decimal places. What matters more about immigration policy, I believe, is something less quantifiable than GDP statistics, and that is our sense of ourselves as one nation. We should consider ourselves, that is, as fellow citizens who have common interests that we can deliberate about together. It helps us to have that sense and govern ourselves if we all, or almost all, speak the same language and have a shared sense of belonging. That degree of social cohesion is not the same thing as conformity, and it's compatible with immigration, but it's harder to achieve the more immigration we have, and that's true even though it's through no fault of the immigrants themselves in many cases. The last comprehensive immigration legislation that Congress seriously considered would have doubled immigration from 10 to 20 million people over the course of a decade. It's hard to believe that this expansion would have made it more likely that the immigrants would have succeeded economically or become integral parts of our society, and it's hard to believe as well that it would have made it more likely that newcomers and natives alike would consider themselves part of the same group. We are, to some extent, a nation of immigrants, but we should never want to have sub-nations of immigrants. And uncontrolled immigration, with the law routinely flouted, adds to these problems additional damage to social trust, as well as damage to the rule of law. At the same time, we must always remember that immigrants, would-be immigrants, and illegal immigrants are human beings with dignity and fundamental rights, that they are creatures made in the image of God, as we are. Dehumanizing rhetoric directed toward them, as when illegal immigrants are treated as though all of them were violent or accused of poisoning the blood of our country, whatever lunacy is entailed by that phrase, should be avoided and indeed condemned. We should also reject the apocalypticism that too many immigration hawks indulge. Lax border policies do not pose a threat of imminently ending America. If you don't have borders, you don't have a country, the president likes to say. Well, luckily, we have both. The evils that can attend immigration control don't justify refraining from well-considered reforms that seek to bring about an inflow that is smaller, higher skilled, and compliant with the law. One reason to want a moderate pro-immigration policy, more moderate than we've had for the last few decades, is to prevent a political backlash that yields demagoguery and excess. If freedom conservatives avoid the mistakes I've mentioned while making the cases for needed reforms as aggressively, creatively, and persistently as we can, we'll have done our part to repay the obligation we owe to Madison, Lincoln, and our other forebears. We'll make it possible for Americans 50 years from now, on our 300th anniversary, to be still free, still secure, still prosperous, and still worried about the future of our country. Thank you very much.